the best way to make the microphone work is to switch it on. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mārcis. I'm a researcher at Center for East European Policy Studies here in Riga, Latvia. And it is my honor to moderate the last panel of today's discussion, titled How Different is Local and National Governance in Central Asia? So, in previous two panels, the speakers focused on economical issues in the so important region of Central Asia, and also security challenges, both internal and external, that the countries in the region face. But if we take it all together, then it is up to the governments, up to the regimes to also analyze the specific issues at stake and to agree on the policies, on the overall strategy, how to combine all these challenges in economical sphere, in security sphere, in maybe different spheres like political cooperation with different regions, how to apply these, how to analyze these, and how to implement the best ones that are best suited for the local societies. In this panel, we will try to look at the regimes of Central Asian countries, to the governance types, and to the different challenges that these regimes faces. In order to tackle these issues, we have three great speakers, three great experts. I would like to introduce the first, also in the order of appearance, and the first that's sitting closest to me is Iveta Reinholde. She's an associate professor at the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Latvia. Her main research interests are concerned with public administration reform and policy analysis. She has considerable practical experience in public policy issues, policy advice, good governance and public management issues, including Ukraine, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan since 2013. And Iveta Reinholde is also an independent expert in Congress of Local and Regional Authorities in the Council of Europe, so academic and also a little bit of institutional background. In the middle we have Olga Speiser. She is holding a PhD in political science and international relations from CNSPO. Her research focuses on EU policy towards the post-Soviet space, in particular towards Central Asia. She has also conducted an extensive fieldwork in several countries in Central Asia. And moreover, she is teaching Eurasian geopolitics and EU institutions in CNSPO campuses in Paris and other cities. And the last speaker, but last but not least, is Fabio Bellefatti. I hope that I pronounce it somewhat correctly. He teaches Central Asian politics and social issues at Vilnius University Center for Oriental Studies, where he also coordinates the Center for Contemporary Central Asian Studies. Prior to that, he worked for Italian and Lithuanian think tanks and analytical centers, preparing articles and reports on internal politics of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Iran, as well as Central Asian regional relations. He has been living in Lithuania for the last 4 years and a half, and previously he lived and worked in Latvia and Tajikistan, among other places. So he's also one of the people that both have local knowledge and knowledge about Central Asian region. So we are going to organize this discussion in 2 rounds, because we have only 3 speakers, but it also lets them to speak more widely on the issues they would like to cover. And after these 2 rounds, I will give the floor to your questions and, of course, your comments. So already listening at this discussion, so try to think about challenging questions which to ask. So, turning to the discussion, I would like first turn to Iveta Reinholde and ask a simple question, but maybe that to which answer isn't so simple. So, If you look at Central Asia, what is the current state of play in this region? In previous panels, there was already mentioned that we can't look at Central Asia as a coherent, as a unified region. We must look at specific countries. So if you look at governance issues at several levels, both maybe at local and at national level, so what are the main challenges that these regional countries are currently facing?
And just trying to answer to your question, I suppose I should start with a joke, just to wake up people after the lunch, and it's still already late afternoon. And this old joke, which you all know, is very simple. Politicians come and go after each elections, but bureaucrats stay in town forever. I suppose you know from where it comes, and this joke has been part of the way how we perceive governance structures. However, at the same time, this joke describes as the Western world looks on role of governance and public administration, that bureaucrats are the ones who actually ensure certain stability when the political power changes, different ideas is changing, so there is some sort of root of sustainability. At the same time, there is just a bit different story from real life, but I remember when I was lecturing in Kazakhstan, and after lectures on civil service reform, the young person educated in Germany and with a very good education in legal issues approached me with a question. And this question was very simple, like, please tell me how many questions I should ask during the interview when we are trying to select best candidates for the position. At that moment, I was simply, I would say, I lost my voice, because for me it thought, come on, what's going on? Why the question is? And since this young person, young professional, noticed that I'm a bit shocked, he tried to explain why he asked me such a question. And the point was that, see, if I would ask 6 questions to the candidate A on 7 questions to the candidate B, and afterwards I will take to work the candidate A, then this B could say, okay, he has some sort of privilege, or vice versa. If I would take the B with the largest number of the questions asked during the interview, then actually you check his knowledge more than my knowledge. Therefore, this situation really shocked me, and I thought on this even being back from Kazakhstan and Latvia, because I never experienced something here, and I never experienced that such questions might be important. But at the same time, just putting together these 2 points, the old joke and the real life question, this explains that if we look on Central Asia, then of course these countries are not coherent. They are different each, but they have their own administrative culture. And their own administrative culture are influenced as by the experience during Soviet regime, as by their traditional social structure, what they have in their countries. And of course, now they are also actually influenced by the ideas which are brought back by young professionals being educated in Western, in China, in Japan. So this is so, I would say, complex picture. But just to give maybe some certain numbers for auditoria to see what's going on with public administration, I would like to rely to World Bank Governance Effectiveness Index. It's not completely describing the picture, but at least give a tendency. And if you are looking on this index, which measures effectiveness of governance in a scale of 100 points, then actually 97 is for Japan. So Japan is almost perfect country who implements all the policies it passes. But we know sometimes it takes so many years for Japan just to change one certain word in a respective law. If you're looking on the countries of Central Asia, what we have Kazakhstan with the number 54. So these are data for 2014. So Kazakhstan 54, Uzbekistan 27, Tajikistan 22, Kyrgyzstan 18, and Turkmenistan 17. So in a scale of 100 points, we see that these countries are actually in this first 25, except the Kazakhstan. Just for comparison, for Latvians here in the auditorium, Latvia is about 82, 83. Estonians are on the same level. So, more or less. Yeah. So, but this actually, from the academic point of view, we could say these are just numbers. They are not describing too much. But at the same time, these numbers still describe the administrative culture. Why? Because first of all, this government effectiveness index is based also on the surveys, what citizens consider, what business consider, what civil servants consider, how they go on with implementation of policies. And just, if I should say very, very straightforward, actually this index shows how successful is country implementing its own policies. This is just one picture. Another picture, just if we look from perspective of the civil service, then again we could see that this picture is not, again, so unified. For example, Kazakhstan has adopted Western-style civil service law. Kazakhstan has actually divided political and administrative positions. So this is what we understand as a political and administrative division. At the same time, for Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, yes, they have civil service laws, but there is no division between administrative and political positions. While finally for Uzbekistan there is no civil service law, they still live with the labor law. I would say it's nothing wrong, because each country decides on its own public administration. Because public administration, it's administrative machine which implements the political decisions. But at the same time, this administrative machine also work not for sake of politicians, but for sake of society, for sake of citizens. And actually, this administrative machine should consider and do and implement policies so that really citizens see some tangible benefits. So actually, by what I try to describe, we see that, of course, simply as we used to say in the academic world, we could say a little progress has been made, but at the same time, it again depends how we measure the progress. Maybe from our point of view, looking on those countries, we say, this is little progress. But if we look from the perspective of those countries, this is huge progress for them, and this progress has taken so many efforts. So therefore, before we really say the public administration in those countries is good or bad, we should look from a different perspective. Of course, there are also some challenges, and the public administrations as at the national and also local level in those countries are facing challenges. And these challenges are closely connected to what we discussed this morning. For example, every society once reached certain level when the society is simply tired of never-ending reforms and the society wants to have tangible results. In these countries, one of those challenges where actually society wants to see tangible results are the welfare reforms, healthcare reforms. And these are public services at local level, at national level. Because the public services, this is the most tangible way how actually every single citizen actually evaluates the government. And if the citizen receives public services, then the government is good. if there is no public services or these public services are weak, then maybe there is something wrong with the government. Therefore, actually, I should say that any reforms here, it's not just as we easily say, adopt your reform agenda and go ahead. No, to my mind, this Western type approach doesn't work here. Of course, it's easy for us to say that you should have your specific reform agenda, but this reform agenda is widely influenced by many complex factors. And these complex factors, it's not make the reform, not simply reforms that we go for Western model or China model or whatever model, but here we see that administrators in those countries has tried to accumulate certain capacity to implement policies under so complex conditions, taking into account role of formal institutions, taking into account role of cultural norms, social norms, and actually challenging economic and security conditions. And this is actually progress that they have made. Of course, it's hard to measure by saying you have this or you have no established certain institution, but at the same time, looking over the perspective of time, public administrations has accumulated this capacity, and they are trying now to fight with the reform agenda. How it will come out and how it will result, this is also a matter of a time. But at least they already did something to go on.
Okay, thank you. One small add-on question. So you started with the joke about politicians leaving and bureaucrats staying. So in countries of Central Asia, we have several, let's say, older leaders who probably in maybe next 5-10 years, maybe even quicker, will leave the political, will leave the ruling. So has the public administration or the state institutions capacity to continue the way how the state develops, or it's too closely linked with political regime? So with the change of the leader also, there will be quite a lot of challenges to the public administration space.
This would be one of the greatest challenges for public administration, because of course we could cope and we could believe that bureaucrats are so sustainable now and they accumulated so experience and capacity to ensure smooth transit between changes of political leaders. However, I'm not certainly for 100% sure that it would happen, because here we still also should take into account that maybe if there is division between political and administrative positions, it still does not mean that bureaucrats will stay when the politicians will go. And this challenge is that how to ensure the stability. Now, stability is based on stability of both, stability of public administration and stability of politicians. But what will happen if one of those elements will go? This is, of course, from the academic point of view, we could play around prognosis, but let's be realistic that this will not be easy task, and this will not be easy days. No.
Okay, then one more challenge that Central Asian countries has to face. So turning to our next speaker, Olga Speiser. So Yvette already touched about specific criteria, specific indexes or specific elements of the local governments that we should take into consideration. My question to you would be about overall perceptions of society and also to the political elites or the regimes on the issue, on the several issues, for example, on what is the purpose of the state. Also the perception on the issues on human rights, democracy, on those issues that we highly value here in Europe. So, but maybe they have different understandings in Central Asia. And of course, what are the differences, what are the common elements between society and between the regimes on how they perceive these issues? And also, maybe if you can a little bit touch upon the vision of, let's say, overall vision for the future that exists in society and the state, because as one of the experts that have done the field research there, then you probably have been in contact with local population and you have this personal viewpoint on this. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. It's indeed an excellent question, because if we want to assess the approach or the foreign policy of an actor, we first have to understand its reputation and its image in the region, and also the question, is it perceived as a legitimate actor to promote political norms and so on. So what I'd like to do now is to share some of my findings with you that I have conducted during field research. That being said, however, I feel a bit embarrassed, because I have to provide the Central Asian point of view without being Central Asian myself. But what I want to do is just to give a general idea of the perception of the EU, of its political norms, of its model, and so on, because I base that on the research that I made in the region, conducting interviews, but also citing opinion polls, and so that means that I do not claim to be fully representative. So it's not fully representative, and I also have to emphasize that I conducted interviews and research with elites, and does not represent the general opinion of the population. So just to make this sure. And I will talk about three main issues. The first, how visible, to what extent is the EU a visible actor in Central Asia, which will be very briefly, just to have an idea, is the EU considered to be an actor? And then what images does the EU have in the region? And finally, how attractive or how is European normative model, so democracy, human rights, and all these things, how is this perceived in the region? Speaking about visibility, I'd like to quote one of my interview partners in Dushanbe, who she was a program director of an EU program. She was in touch with the EU, and she said, the European Union is known to those who want and need to know about the EU. Otherwise, it is like a UFO that people see but don't really understand. So in other words, actually, the EU is visible when national actors have to deal with the EU. Also, we have to specify, because the awareness is quite high in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. It's much less in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and as the most remote republic, Tajikistan. But still, we have to remember that the EU has extended considerably its presence in the region in the last years, with the opening of delegations and embassies and so on. However, it is still what prevails. It's still the fact that the EU is perceived via its member states. So not so much as a single actor, but via its member states. So officials in Astana, in Bishkek, in Dushanbe, in Tashkent would rather say that they would rather contact the embassy of Germany, of France, or the UK when they want to get in touch with Europe, rather than the EU delegation. So this needs to be taken into account. It's still, so the member states are more and more prevail in the awareness, in the consciousness about Europe. Also, what maybe adds to the difficulty that EU is not so much perceived as a single actor, is that it's difficult to understand what the EU is. It has a difficult identity. The unusual nature of the EU being neither a country nor a real international organization is what poses some difficulties to understand what it is and what it wants. Okay. However, Europe has very clear images in the Europe, and I identified 5 main images that the EU has, and I'm afraid that what I'm going to say maybe will not please so much EU officials, but so there are positive and negative images, of course. The first image, that the most recurrent feature that comes up in conversations when you talk about the EU-Europe, is that Europe is part of the West. So West as a homogeneous entity. So it is often put in the same category as the NATO, as the US and the OC. And the notion of the West, this is maybe really important to underline, the notion of the West has really changed throughout the last 25 years. So while in the first decade after the downfall of the Soviet Union, it was considered to be the only truly workable alternative to communism, this has changed throughout the years, and paradoxically with a growing engagement of the West. And what I also observed is that this image of the West is in decline. Sometimes what is mentioned is that the West is aggressively promoting its own norms, transplanting its own models without consideration of domestic contexts, and more increasingly in the last years, what is put as a contrast to the Western EU model, European model, is the so-called Asian model. But maybe I will comment that on that later. So as an alternative model to the Western governance model. Then the second image that the EU sometimes evokes in the region is to be somehow patronizing, somehow paternalistic in its approach, that the attitude is reported to be sometimes patronizing because evoking a student-teacher relationship, saying, okay, this is our model, so we have good experience, but take an example of us, and so on. And this is a sensitive topic in Central Asia because after centuries of domination and domination by foreign actors, the elites are very sensitive to this big brother attitude of other actors, not only the EU, but also of other actors, Turkey, Russia, China, and so on. And so they don't want really to be lectured on what their political model should look like. They are happy to receive recommendations and advices, but this is also a new trend that is much more pronounced today than it was maybe 15 years ago. The third image that I identified is that a positive one. The EU is a source of modernization, and so it is needed to modernize both economy, rule of law, and so on. The term modern is very much linked to Europe, in contrast, for instance, to Russia. Some officials in Kazakhstan have commented that Russia is still important, but to modernize, they need Europeans. And this is interesting because I compared the EU documents that have been published, issued in 2007 and a bit afterwards, and the EU documents and speeches nowadays. So there's a real difference because the term modern comes up very much in the new documents. So they understood somehow that the EU is linked to modernism, modernization, and this is something they want to highlight. So they understood to exploit this image. Another image is that the EU is a counterbalancer. So as a Western actor, a counterbalancer. This is a very geopolitical reading, right? But as a counterbalancer to Russia and China. And yes. However, even if although it's considered to be a counterbalancer, its weight is not really is deemed to be very significant at the same time. But at the same time, it's needed to counterbalance the others. In terms of political model that the EU represents, it is both attractive and somehow rejected in practice. So it's a fascination for, in theoretical terms, for the historical achievements of the EU to put together so many different states and make them work together. However, this appreciation, this acknowledgement of the EU as a political model is rather something in terms of historical achievements, which is not transposable to the Central Asian context. And now, let me comment a bit on how the EU's normative model, the normative dimension of its approach is perceived in Central Asia. And I try to approach this question through 4 sub-questions. First question are EU norms perceived to be legitimate and universal to Central Asia? And as you know, all Central Asian republics have formally adopted. Is it me? Sorry. And they have formally adopted very modern constitutions and so on. Also, the leaders, they publicly demonstrate their commitments to democracy. I remind you, for instance, the strategy of Kazakhstan, this 2050 strategy that outlines the political strategy of Kazakhstan, how it wants to be in 2050, and Kazakhstan clearly states that they want to be a functioning, or they want to achieve highest standards of democratization and human rights. However, the clear formula is first economics and then politics. So there is somehow a commitment to democracy, a formal one, but a prudent one, if there is any. But at the same time, they deny, and this is something that is also a trend more and more, the universality of democracy and of human rights. They argue together with Russia that democracy is not a codified international concept, but it's a model which can be filled with meaning by any actors regarding its culture and domestic context and so on. So they reject a standardized Western model of democracy. Even some, this is maybe not so surprising, but I really kept this term in mind, but some Uzbek officials, they even spoke about democratic fundamentalism, that the EU and especially the US, so I have to actually specify that the US is perceived to be more aggressive than the EU in this term, so there's a big difference. However, the EU is also considered to be quite patronizing in this term. And yes, so, but also some, if these were some officials, however, some of my interview partners from civil society organizations, they showed sometimes sort of disappointment with double standards of the EU. For instance, how they deal with Uzbekistan, that Germany was interested to keep its military base in termins and contributed to lift the sanctions against Uzbekistan and so on. So there are different views on that. Yes, and then the second question, to understand if the EU's model is attractive, is does the EU provide a successful and attractive, desirable model to Central Asia? And, for instance, take the example of Kazakhstan. Prior to 2010, there's a difference. Prior to 2010, Kazakhstan was very eager to emphasize its orientation towards Europe. It has issued this plan, Path to Europe, Pуть в Европу, or something like that. So in this program, it took the EU as the example for democratic standards. However, it can be actually assessed as a political strategy, because they wanted to have the OC chairmanship in 2010, because afterwards this enthusiasm for the EU model cooled down, and this is visible in comments and speeches that Nazarbayev makes and has been making recently. For instance, during a visit to Paris, he commented on a journalist's question about human rights situation in his country, that actually the performance of his country even is better than some of the European countries. I think he was thinking maybe about Hungary, I don't know. But so there's a more, let's say, more self-consciousness and a more contestation of not being lectured on these issues. And finally, so as I said, this image of democracy and human rights has declined somehow, and more you hear a clear speech of government saying that it's against harsh criticism of Europe's interference in domestic context and so on. And even the so-called model of the only democracy in Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, even there you can observe a different approach. It was very much oriented towards the European model of democracy in the 1990s, and then even Akayev himself actually said that democracy in Kyrgyzstan shall follow the Kyrgyz way and not a European way, and so on. Well, why this shift in perception of the EU model? I think maybe we can discuss this later. There are several reasons. So, Europe's normative dimension is increasingly met with suspicion somehow. So the officials, the elite, argues more and more that it's not possible to transplant a Western model to the region, and they increasingly contrast other alternative models to the European models. And yeah, maybe we will speak about that later, about alternative models that these people evoke.
Okay, thank you. So, great introduction into how Europe is perceived and how European values and standards are perceived in Central Asia. But also there's a question about implementation on what are the, let's say, strategies currently adopted by Central Asian countries to acquire the necessary objective targets, and are there any coherent strategies that we currently see in the case of Central Asian countries. And here I will turn to Fabio Bellafati, maybe to give him opportunity to answer these questions about the local approaches that are currently implemented in order to tackle issues that relate both to development of countries, to the economic development, to the welfare of societies, and also to the longevity of specific political regime. So go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers a lot for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be here in Riga. I very much enjoyed the two previous presentations, and I actually wanted to add something about what you said concerning EU image in Tajikistan specifically. You mentioned that, according to your interview partner, basically nobody knows it unless they have to deal with it. I slightly disagree on that, in the sense that, in my experience at least, one thing that is known to everybody, at least in Tajikistan, if not the European Union, is definitely Schengen. The Schengen area is an expression that everybody knows about. How do I get a Schengen visa is probably the question that you will be asked more often by common people who want to emigrate, and obviously would very much prefer to emigrate somewhere else rather than to work in a building site in Russia or in Kazakhstan. So in that sense, we do have quite a lot of, I believe, a lot of potential we should work on in terms of image, because the image of economic prosperity is pretty strong. I would like a little bit to take issue with the way in which this idea of model and this idea of democracy and how it can be implemented and the so-called Central Asian paths to democracy or to reform has been approached in the previous panel as well. In the sense that it seems to me that we don't take these statements from Central Asian leaders like Nazarbayev, for example, when he talks about a Kazakh way of development and reform, or Akayev when he was talking about a Kyrgyz way of reform. We don't take them critically enough, and we don't really understand that behind these supposed cultural, essentialistic understanding of their own nation actually lies regime survival considerations. So a lot of what we hear, I remember some time ago, Nazarbayev made a statement, critic of European criticism about corruption in Central Asia, and he said that, in our cultures this is somehow acceptable or somehow okay. From what I could personally see, speaking with common people, that's not the case. Nobody is happy about paying a significant part of their salary out in bribes to policemen or to university professors and so on. It's not really a cultural thing, it's a purely economic one, and no one is happy about wasting their salaries like this. But we keep hearing from Central Asian governments the idea that we have distinct cultures, we have different specific features, and therefore your model doesn't fully apply, or if it applies, it can apply only with a slower pace and in a more gradual way. That's not. I don't believe this is the case. I believe this is very much, in many cases, is just an excuse for not wanting to tackle some issues, and it has very much to do with the problem of regime survival. Because let us not forget. Political elites in Central Asia do benefit very, very much from the current political setting, which is, except in the case of Kyrgyzstan and Mongolia, and I will expand a little bit the framework, but it is an authoritarian model, and it is, in some cases at least, and particularly in the case of Tajikistan, it's a pretty kleptocratic one. It's a system in which the elite benefits personally from appropriation of state resources. So in that sense, when we hear cultural justifications to reject appeals to reform or to change, it very much is a defense of elite's position, and we should be aware of that, and we shouldn't be fooled by these, because otherwise we're not going to implement effective strategies in dealing with these countries. So. The regime survival component is something that I believe has been touched upon a little bit in the previous panel, but probably not as much as necessary. And I've heard the idea that actually the current regimes are guarantees of stability, which I would also like to take issues with, in the sense that the main challenges to Central Asian stability so far have come from the regimes themselves. The Tajik civil war comes from the desire of the old Soviet Tajik elite to maintain its power, to essentially perpetuate its control over the political system. The Andijan massacre in 2005 is a result of a regime action. And the two revolutions, or however you want to call them, in Kyrgyzstan, and particularly the latest one with its side effects in the south of the country with the ethnic clashes, are definitely the result of regime behavior, or in the case of Kyrgyzstan, of regime collapse. So we need to think about it, we need to consider these, and bear in mind that when we talk about the security of the region, it's fantastic to talk about Islam and so on, it's very, if you want, European-centric view, but what determines instability in the region is the features of the current regimes, and the current regimes are fairly rigid, in the sense that when they talk about gradual progress and gradual reform, they actually are, I believe, trying to buy time for themselves to maintain and secure a political system and a power setting that is beneficial, economically speaking, for the elite. So this is, I believe, an element that we should add to the discussion in this regard.
Thank you. That was unfortunately short.
Well, I guess we can discuss further
but
on.
we can elaborate.
Sure.
And now we come to the second round. Already I see some of the speakers are eager to introduce the outside actors to the region, and Central Asia is definitely a region where geography matters, and it was mentioned both on the panel on economical issues and of course on political and security challenges that the region face, but also in ways how these countries are trying to construct their development, construct their states and their societies. Also here Central Asia has quite a lot of choices. If you look geographically, then Central Asia, to the north from Central Asia we have authoritarian regime in Russia that is becoming more conservative, more authoritarian by each month, by each year. To the west we have Western liberal democracies in Europe. In between we have countries that strive for fuller implementation of this European liberal model. To the south we have world's largest democracy, India, with some of great opportunities, great experiences how country can actually function with how developing country can fully implement democratic tradition and to tackle the necessary challenges of the development. To the east we have, of course, China with its quite interesting economical and development model, which focuses on economic, on social welfare, and of course not giving any attention currently to the democracy as such. And of course further east we have also quite a lot of fully functioning democracies like in Japan, in South Korea, but also with their specific local characteristics. So looking at this overall geographical context, so what are the models that Central Asian countries are looking as maybe ideals, or they are doing what China has done, what one of the Chinese researchers on China, Joshua Cooper-Ramo, in his 2014 article, the Beijing Consensus, mentioned on free terms, on which one quite important aspect was given to the localization of specific approaches and choosing what is the best suited for the specific state. So in your understanding, what are both the foreign influences and the foreign ideals, the outside ideals that the ideal models that Central Asian countries are looking forward to implement, and or they are developing their unique local approach on development? So Yvette, we can start with you.
Yes, and this turns out to be a very challenging question. Because we could discuss this for hours and hours while everyone falls asleep in the auditorium.
You can choose one direction and
that would be smartest to choose one direction. And here is again, if we are looking on these countries, on this classical division, politicians and bureaucrats, it's about the chicken and egg. Who was the first one? And if we debate about chicken and egg, so politicians or bureaucrats are the first one, then in these countries sometimes it's really hardly to distinguish. Public administration model is such because of the political regime or vice versa. But at the same time, what we can see here, we can see Kazakhstan, who is some sort of active reformer, partly because of its economic possibilities, to be the one who really take ideas and implement reforms. At the same time, we have also actually strong centralization, because if we discuss an again classical European understanding about the autonomous local governments, then this doesn't work out here because the local governments are strongly supervised by the national government. There are governors who are appointed by the national government, and these governors are accountable to president. So actually there is hand of national government at every single village, let's say so. Just to explain. At the same time, all these countries have made some sort of, or I would say transferred, something like, which is, we know in Europe, well known, national academies of public administration, some sort of education system to educate officials, to inherited officials, civil servants, everyone who works in public administration with the latest skills, knowledge about the modernization. But again, the question is when the education will bring results. These results will not be by tomorrow lunchtime. This takes at least 5-7 years unless the certain generation of educated bureaucrats are settled in the ministries, they work on the policies, and they finally implement those policies. And in this context, these all factors make so complex picture that when I ask, and I suppose this would be the real explanation, when I ask to Kazakh civil servants, what is your vision of your country, then these answers were so different. Some say, I do care on my private economy, so on my private benefits. Therefore, I take a position because of certain private benefits. So I suppose I should not explore this, what kind of private benefits you can get if you are in a quite high position. Some others said, but I still do care about the future of my country. And of course, then the question is how long this young person will do care on the future of his own country with a certain salary which is not which is not too high, let's say so. And some others said, my family wanted me to work in the public administration because they thought this would be good job, this would be respectful job, so I started to work in civil service. And again, these answers explain that we have here mix of these approaches, that the social norms of traditional society are as same important as some formal rules and formal laws, and they both come together. Therefore, actually, if we say about those countries, we could sell them best models in every industry, but I'm not sure whether those best models will work. Actually, these best models, if we looking on other countries like in Latvia and in Baltics, sometimes we also took some best models from West countries and then found that no, it doesn't work out. So actually, here is the same situation, that the modernization is more like in a certain details, and the point is for what purposes modernization is used to be. For purposes to keep stability as it is now, for purposes to improve economic conditions, social conditions, or just because it's so nice to be modernized. So these are different motives behind all that, and therefore, again, we can criticize the regime because there is a point for criticism. But again, how can we, or let's say I always, and sometimes have considered myself, how can I suggest to decentralize power in one of those countries if I'm not sure that this decentralization will work with the right purpose, whether this decentralization of power will really again benefit in some public services, and this really will improve the real life of those people who are living in a different parts of the countries. So these are like different levels, and of course we can discuss on a level of political regime and general public administration system, but vice versa, we again should put actually these issues of the social security of those people. Because those people, they don't actually, any individual, they don't want to wait for bright times in the nearest future. They want to have such public administration, such system of local governments who is capable to resolve problems now, not after a year, not after 2 years. And of course, in most cases we see that local governments are not capable to resolve these problems just because they receive money from the national government, and as much national government allocated as much money there is. So these are so complex issues, but nevertheless I do believe that we need to support with ideas explaining what they can do to go on a way of modernization. And if we provide more advice, more directions of reforms, not only one, then actually benefit will be for both sides. Us and them who have, and them countries in Central Asia who have freedom of choice, because then they can choose road, like road A or road B or road C. Or as what is my favorite joke again for students when I ask whether they have read Alice in Wonderland. When Alice met the Cheshire cat and asked cat which way she should go, the cat said, "It depends where you want to get." And here is, to some way, one of those critical situations and critical conditions.
So, in your understanding, it's best to focus on recommendations, on advice, but not on patronizing, not on saying what is the, let's say, this is the ideal and you have to implement this ideal.
My personal experience shows that it's better to provide advice and more choices what to do, because it's like in a family. If you will say, kid, do this, kid for sure will do vice versa. And sometimes it doesn't work out. And here, more options, the options what can be adjusted to these complex conditions might be helpful. This is my belief in this.
Okay. Ms. Weiser, what are your thoughts on this? Elaborating not only in the EU, maybe you have also some views on the other actors that are quite important to each other models.
Yeah, first I will retake again what I mentioned earlier, that the Western model or the European model of democracy and governance has experienced a decline in attractiveness in this region. And this has to do with two things, actually. First is that in the early 1990s, it was considered to be the only really model alternative to communism, and it was linked, and this is really significant, it was linked to prosperity, economic growth, stability. This is why the Western model was attractive. But now, 25 years afterwards, democracy is believed more and more not to work in the region. And the best examples that the elites and the other Central Asian countries cite is Kyrgyzstan, which is considered in the West sometimes as the good example of a more or less functioning democracy. In the region itself and in Russia, it is cited as an example to say it doesn't work. Because look at Kyrgyzstan, it's always like this phrase, look at Kyrgyzstan, what is happening? These are the disastrous consequences of democracy. It triggers chaos, instability. They had 27 prime ministers in 25 years, and there's no stability. They blame Kyrgyzstan for being an example that democracy doesn't work. And this is big contrast in the discourse of Western observers and Central Asian themselves. Now, the other factor is also that now there's also the availability of other workable alternative models to Europe, let's say, to liberal democracies, and especially models where authoritarian rule goes hand in hand with economic growth, and they cite Russia. I mean, Russia is now in a crisis, but still it was considered to be, okay, look, they achieved also economic growth, China, of course, Singapore, and so on. So now they have the, let's say, a fundament to say there are alternative models and they work too, because what is attractive is prosperity, economic growth, and others are able to provide that. Sometimes, yes, what is also cited is the so-called, when they refer to democracy, and they are more and more reluctant to refer to the European or Western model of democracy, then they refer to this so-called Asian model of democracy. And this is very present in speeches of Kazakhstan's President Nazarbayev, for instance, who evokes South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, and so on for providing interesting models for both economic growth and democracy. Sometimes also Japan and India are cited for being democracies who achieved economic growth, technological modernization, but combined with the preservation of traditions, which seems also attractive to this region, to the countries, because sometimes Europe is considered to be a country that has lost its tradition, that belies its traditions, that, I don't know, with this in this process of modernization has lost many values. It's sometimes is a symbol for immorality somehow. So then they have these contrast models. They are able to preserve traditions, but at the same time provide for economic growth. And these reference to these Asian models have increased in the last 15 years. And of course, there's not really a distinguishable model of this is an Asian model. There are no really criteria. It's more like a symbolic reference, because no one really knows what is this Asian model about. But it's still, I think, when we want to see a contrast, then the Western, let's say, model of democracy emphasizes this permanent contestation and competition between power groups and so on, while the Asian model provides respect for the leader. It's an elected leader, if you want. So the civil society and population have given him, mostly him, not her, like this legitimacy, but then it's respected, and he provides for stability and predictability, which is not the case so much for Western democratic models. And so it's about, also there's this image of Western model to emphasize individualism rather than collectivism, which is the case for so-called Asian models. The Asian model stands for loyalty, respect, also respect for the leader. And and this is the contrast to this permanent contestation and competition in Western democratic models. And also, for instance, they turn to Russia too. It's not an Asian model, but sometimes they evoke Russia as a model for, let's say, so-called electoral democracy, where democracy works top-down and not bottom up, right? Where actually the citizens respect the authority once it is elected, and the authority has the monopoly of political power, and it is not so much contested. So it's like, this is the contrast. If you personally consider this to be a democracy, I think it's up to you. It's true that the international treaties do not really provide a clear codification for what a democracy is, but this is what they evoke as examples, also to, I think, to justify why they increasingly shift away from looking towards Europe and the West when they look for models for democracy or governance.
Thank you. So, and now, Mr. Galfati, your thoughts on the question asked.
Yeah. So lots of very good ideas there, and I would actually like to pick up on what Iveta said about basically the delivery of social services and public services to the population, and take advantage of this to, if you want, criticize a little bit the way in which this discussion about the models is being posed, because we are talking about geographically contiguous models, so China, Russia, and so on, but we don't look at historical models. And I believe that would be probably a more useful exercise, in the sense that, at least in my opinion, both for elites and definitely to a very large extent for the population of numerous Central Asian countries, the Soviet model remains the relevant one. And this might sound as complete heresy to the Latvian people in the audience, and well, to anybody who lives in the Baltic states, because obviously we have a very different understanding of the Soviet system, but we need to realize that the image of the Soviet Union for Central Asians is quite different from what we have here, and this is not just among elder people or nostalgic individuals. It is a feeling that you can hear from university students and people who weren't even born at the time of the Soviet Union. So if we expand a little bit the perspective about models and we look at historical models, then we realize that well, the Soviet model provides a number of advantages for the elites, in the sense that what they find appealing is obviously the repressive side of it, possibility to effectively control society and to counter challenges to political power, but also more economically speaking, because of some of the practices that existed in the Soviet times, such as, for example, the way in which the cotton system was managed. And this is pretty much unchanged, especially in Uzbekistan, which still employs a system of collective forced labor that is fairly similar to the one that was in place during Soviet period. So on the one side, it is appealing for the elites because they would dream to be able to exert that amount of control in their society and to enjoy a level of power that is that stable for their benefit. But it is also appealing for the population because in terms of amount of public services that were delivered, well, the Central Asian states have lost quite a lot since the fall of the Soviet Union, and they haven't been able to recover as the Baltic states and most of Eastern Europe has managed to do. Kazakhstan has partly managed to compensate that, although they still have enormous issues of urban and rural development levels. But let's face it, Kazakhstan has an amount of natural resources that is enormous, and it would be surprising if they hadn't been able to catch up at least a little bit. So on the one side you have these, the appeal of the Soviet Union as a factor of aspiration. We would like to be back to the situation where we had free education, free housing, and essentially, let's state it frankly, handouts from Moscow to the budget of the Soviet republics. But in parallel, it also legitimizes the lack of democratic reform, because elites can say, well, okay, they offer a democratic model, but remember that things were better in Soviet times, which was definitely not a democratic system. Another model that is not included in the lists that we are discussing is the nationalist model. I wouldn't go as far as say the fascist model, but some countries, at least two of them, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, have, and definitely Kyrgyzstan under the time of Kurmanbek Bakiev, have a very strongly nationalist internal agenda. Especially in Tajikistan nowadays, with the concept of Aryanism and an almost race-based idea of national identity. It's a very exclusivist one. It's a very dangerous one. I believe it threatens the security and the stability of Tajikistan more than radical Islam in the medium term. And it's something that we are not really doing much about. I mean, we talk about governance, democratization, and so on, and perhaps something more useful from a European perspective would be to encourage these regimes, once we realize that anyway they're not going to democratize just because we ask them, because there is no political incentive to do that, but we could encourage the development of different internal political discourses. at least something that is not based on parochial nationalism. Lots of the problems in the Fergana Valley, I think it was mentioned in the previous panel about the borders and so on. A lot of these issues are actually due to the way in which border policies have been implemented as a result of a nationalist agenda, particularly on the side of Uzbekistan, defining Uzbekistan as a land of stability and security versus areas of instability and anarchy, and therefore constructing the border also in the public image as the wall between civilization and chaos. And that boils down very much to a nationalist idea of an Uzbek superiority in the region. So in that sense, this is also a model that is being employed and we're not really looking at. And it's a quite risky one. Obviously, it guarantees a little bit of regime legitimacy. It is used as a way to secure legitimacy to the regimes, but it doesn't really help in the medium and long term the creation of peaceful societies. Kazakhstan obviously is on a completely different level because they have openly adopted a Kazakhstani, as in the sense of a civic identity model rather than a nation-based Kazakh one. Then the Singapore model was mentioned. This often comes up, especially in the case of Kazakhstan. Singapore is an example of a country that is not democratic. It is, depending on how it is defined, it is either a strictly controlled democracy or a soft authoritarian regime. But anyway, Nazarbayev definitely looks at Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore as an example of a country that managed to provide an enormous level of welfare to its citizens. But the problem is that I believe this is, I'm not really sure here, obviously I don't know Nazarbayev personally, we should ask him, but I'm not sure if he says that just for the sake of rhetoric, without knowing the differences that exist between the two cases, or if he genuinely believes that this can be applied. I don't think it can be applied for a number of reasons. First of all, Singapore did not have at the time when its spectacular economic development started, did not have the same amount of natural resources as Kazakhstan. So obviously you don't have those kind of rentier behaviors that tend to favor the establishment of non-democratic regimes. It was actually a fairly poor British colony which desperately needed economic development and decided to invest on becoming a financial hub. But if you want to become a financial hub, you need to provide a stable legal framework to do that. And that does not really match very well with a non-democratic system in which obviously personal connections, patronage, and broadly speaking, the position in the informal distribution of power is much more important. So Singapore was constrained by its decision to pursue the only way towards economic development, which was the financial one. Singapore is a city-state. It's a very small city. It's a very small country where if you do face a challenge, a revolutionary challenge from the population, you face it right across the corner. So just to put it on a very, very practical level, but Kazakhstan is an enormous state. It's massive. The capital is located in the center of, in the back of beyond, basically. So you can potentially shut down the city. It is much more complicated to, for example, organize something like the Tulip Revolution in Kazakhstan because of the sheer geographic size of the country. You can essentially geographically isolate instability and secure the tenure of the regime in the capital. And Singapore needed to exploit its geographic position as a port between East Asia and South Asia, something that also requires a stable legal framework. So there aren't really there isn't the political pressure on Kazakhstan to really adopt the Singapore model because there aren't the constraints and the limitations that Singapore was facing. Do you still have time? I see your...
Maybe we should give opportunity to ask questions. But if you have, let's say...
Just one thing. one thing that, as was correctly pointed out, Kyrgyzstan is often used as an example, especially by the regime of Islam Karimov, of what will happen if you try to bring in democracy. Anarchy, chaos, ethnic clashes, and so on. One model that is not often mentioned, though, is the Mongolian model. And Mongolia is a country that, especially with Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, shares quite a lot in terms of cultural heritage, the nomadic culture, and so on. But it did manage a successful democratic transition, and it does have fairly good macroeconomic indicators. So we can talk a lot about the reasons why the Mongolian model is more problematic, but it is obviously a choice of convenience to focus on Kyrgyzstan as an example of democratic transition and not, for example, Mongolia, which is a successful one.
And it is sandwiched between Russia and China, like surrounded by authoritarian.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now it's time to open up the floor for the questions. So those who have, please raise your hands. There and back. So.
I'm for the University of Glasgow. I just want to go back to the Singapore story because it's very interesting. I think that Singapore has been used a lot in Kazakhstan because it sells a dream. It sells a dream to the people of Kazakhstan that if you stuck with me, with Albasi, you're gonna become like them. And them, as just mentioned, is Nordistan. So that's why you connect this idea of Singaporean development with the fact that Kazakhstan is something else, and there dies also the rhetoric of Kazakh-Yali, which was what we heard last year about renaming the country. Then someone told him, look, Mongolia don't have democracy, be careful. And also, Singapore showed a successful transition, which is not what we expect to be, because so far we've been saying, transitions, can be, but can it also be worse of what we have? Don't forget, don't look at that too optimistically. So, in a context in which you promise Singapore, and the reality is that oil production is falling, the prices are falling, the life standards are falling. I want to go back to the last two, to Olga and Mr. Belafatti, because I heard a lot from them, the Asian democracy, all that kind of stuff. That rhetoric has been going on for 20 years, and I acknowledge the fact that it's very popular, both in the people and across the elite in Central Asia. How this is going to be changing now that the economy across the region is deteriorating without really adapt?
Okay, we can maybe collect the initial two questions. So here in front, Ambassador, the mic will come shortly.
Yeah, thank you very much. The last comment, I think also in Singapore, maybe the idea that President Nazarbayev wants to project is that a strong leader can really lead the country forward. And I think that is what Lee Kuan Yew was able to do. Without getting into the details of, small city-state, big country, and actually, if the comparisons were to be made, then it would be said that Singapore, with all its deficiencies, but with a strong leader, was able to come forward. And Kazakhstan, of course, with such riches, and a strong leadership, would be able to go forward. I think Kyrgyzstan is used as a case because, to speak against Western thoughts and ideas of democracy, because that is a place where you had a color revolution, where you had a regime change, and that is what these Central Asian countries are mortally afraid of, that it shouldn't happen in their own land. And that is what they have been, actually so far they have been able to successfully deal with that, because when the Arab Spring started, again amongst all these 5 countries, there was that very great nervousness and anxiety that this wave is going to come up to them also. But the question that I have to our first panelist is, you spoke about Kazakhstan and saying that, the leadership is there and education, how will it'll take a long time. But, let's say the programs that were initiated by President Nazarbayev, for instance, the Bolashak initiative, that you choose your brightest students, your brightest, and send them out to the best educational institutions of the world, and they will come back after 3 or 5 years. Now all of them have started coming back, and Bolashak program has expanded very significantly. So all these people who have been educated outside, they have come back and they are working in Kazakhstan, but they are also all very willing elements of the same top-down democratic system that prevails. So, meaning it's not that education will start now. For the last 24 years, that program was launched in 1993, as you know. And it has expanded so much. So how do you explain that? That all this knowledge and, people have gone to the best universities of the United States, of Europe, everywhere, and they have come and they are working there. How do you explain that?
Okay, Professor?
I have a question at the same time, comment. So I'm questioning myself and questioning you panelists. So if we look at the first EU strategy towards Central Asia, it's very ambitious, it covers very many areas, too ambitious, no strategic enough. Now we have Latvian presidency, revised strategy, which is more focused. And it emphasized quite clearly that there are several sectors which fall into EU's interest, which is economics, energy, security, stability, and also governance. And under the governance, there is a wide range of issues: modernization of institutions, rule of law, human rights, and so on. So this basket, governance basket, is a very big one. So, and now I'm questioning myself. During the second panel, our Minister of Foreign Affairs mentioned that EU shouldn't be too ambitious and too patronizing. It really has to work more on a project basis, just defining where Central Asian countries' interests and EU interests come together, and then jointly as owners of this project to implement it. But if we go this first way, it means that actually this modernization and strategic approach is missing. It's more ad hoc, and it's a picking approach. On the other hand, if the Central Asia is quite satisfied with this modernization concept, which was mentioned during the first panel, then I'm questioning myself, what should be modernization agenda then? And again, it's very much about the governance issue, and not so much probably if it falls into public services and administration, but in a wider sense, yeah? Modernization, wide approach, or project-based approach.
And we have several more questions, but we will have another round of questions. So I would ask to keep your answers short so we can have 2 or 3 more questions. So go ahead.
Okay, just keeping shortly. In fact, this talent management program, or to send out the brightest minds and then they come back, this already has given some results. If we are looking then now Kazakhstan is the leading country in that region, active reformer, and not only in a perspective of the executive branch, but also in a wider perspective. But the point is that these brightest minds, when they come back, they are still shaped and they are still facing the traditional culture as it is in Kazakhstan, that the senior person should be respected. Of course, there is slow changes, and these new modernization ideas has been injected, let's say so, but still, these brightest minds also said to me that they are keen to do more for the country, but they are limited within the certain limits of the position, with the certain limits regarding respect the senior one, which doesn't mean that the senior one might have the experience or knowledge or approach. So actually this is a challenging point here. But at least these brightest person already are capable to form, to my mind, they are capable to form some sort of critical mass for modernization, for for positive changes, especially in Kazakhstan.
Okay, and then about Singaporean model and about EU approach about the issues of governance.
Well, I will not comment so much on the Singapore model, but on your question now that we have the economic crisis, and the economic situation is deteriorating, so what about these model references? And indeed, it's interesting. So Russia has lost a bit its credibility to be a model that provides economic growth. What they now need to do is what they have been trying to do since for the last 20 years is diversifying the economy finally, because still the economy is raw material export based, so it's based on exporting raw materials. And so who provides them this help or assistance in diversifying economy? It could be Europe, indeed, but Europe has faced a credibility crisis for the financial crisis, and also not really providing this amount of investment needed. But also, for instance, South Korea. And South Korea is becoming really important because South Korea, what is South Korea providing to Central Asia, is not so much the size of its investment. So it's absolutely clear that China has much more funding and budget. But what South Korea provides are the areas of engagement. So it helps actually, especially Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, in building up manufacturing industry, so not extraction industries, to cement its permanent role to be just raw material exporters. But they have opened a fabric in Kustanai, sorry, it was Toyota, it was not South Korea, but in Andijan, the wool fabric and so on. So South Korea could be an interesting partner, and at the same time it's a reference for being in this Asian model. And then to your question, so indeed governance is now emphasized in this new strategy, and I think, honestly, frankly, that the EU, I'm quite critical about EU's role in Central Asia, but I have to admit that speaking about governance, the EU is on a quite good way, because the EU has understood that it should avoid power terminology, and it does. So if you read EU discourses and documents, they never speak about being a power or something. They avoid power terminology. At the same time, they emphasize two things: to be a source of modernization and being an expert. So the term of expert is coming up all the time in EU documents, being to provide expertise, and I think that it can be successful. So also in terms of governance, because if we look deeper, the EU doesn't have a democracy promotion agenda in Central Asia. There's no program that promotes democracy, but they have this rule of law initiative, for instance, that is considered to be like the back door to, in a long-term process, promote democratic principles, because rule of law is about accepting alternative source of power, in a way, the judiciary. So this could be, I would say, if they manage to do this, rather positive perspective for the EU.
Mr. Belfati?
Yeah, okay, first of all about the Singapore model. Yes, I agree with what Lukanczeski said, that they are trying to sell an image. The image of will become like Singapore if you stick with us. The issue is that there are more limited pressures on the political system in Kazakhstan to actually get to that point, I believe. And here I'll go to your comment. Yes, we could say that Singapore managed to achieve the level where it is despite its limitations because of the strong leader, or we could it is precisely the kind of limitations that were in place that created the political incentive to a better governance performance. And I think this is absolutely crucial, because in Central Asia as well, this is the case. I mean, we should not make the mistake of thinking that Central Asian countries are extremely poor in terms of resources and so on. Tajikistan gets millions in aid, but, for example, spent tens of millions of dollars building a gigantic flagpole in the center of the city. The problem is not with the lack of availability of resources, is with the kind of political incentives that exist to put those resources into good usage for the society as a whole. Now, Kazakhstan, with its demographic division between the mostly Slavic-speaking north and the mostly Kazakh-speaking center and south, faced pretty significant issues in the first years of existence, and the political space in Kazakhstan was a bit more contested than in other Central Asian republics, and that created the incentive to redistribute part of those resources to the population as a whole in the form of social services. This is not because of, well, at least I believe, it's not because of the fact that Nazarbayev is more enlightened or more open-minded than other Central Asian rulers. It is simply the fact that it is more constrained by other factors. Turkmenistan, for example, has enormous resources as well, but it doesn't face this kind of constraints and therefore indulges in much more kleptocratic behaviors. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
So we had two questions here in front.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the panel being much more down to earth than what we did this morning, where we were very flying high at the political level. I was quite impressed by the good points that you pointed out, Mrs. Speiser, and the way the EU is seen there. I think if you did the survey in EU member states, you might get a more negative views among citizens about what the EU is today. And hence my question to you and to the other panelists. My strong impressions during my trips in Central Asia and talking with my Central Asian partners is that there have been three defining moments for the West, and you were right to say the West, because we are the EU, we are France or Germany, but we are all seen as the West under American leadership, right? And in a way it is true. So I think there have been three defining moments for the rupture of trust into the West, and I'd like to hear you whether you feel the same. First is the economic crisis of 2008. Basically, we've been patronizing, the Americans and the Europeans, telling the Central Asians and the rest of the world, you have to get your finances under control. And we proved that we could not do that. We allowed Wall Street to steal the money of our pensioners and to create this huge crisis that has disturbed the whole world. And while we were preaching to others that we have to control our finances and all these people, we, the West, have proved incapable of doing that and unwilling and still unwilling after the crisis. And my feeling is that this crisis of 2008 has really made lose the trust into the West, not only in Central Asia, but in the rest of the world. The second for Central Asia, very important for me, is the war in Afghanistan. You have these American troops coming in there with all their firing powers, with all this vision of a democratic army compared to the Soviet invasion, and the idea that they would manage better than the Soviets. Okay, if you go to Kabul and you speak Russian, you start talking Russian on the streets with older people, they start telling you how nice the Soviets had been. So the extremely bad management of the Afghanistan invasion. And third is probably also, it's linked in a way, the election of the neocons in Washington in 2001, the arrival in power. George Bush with these neocons who despised international law, invaded Iraq and all that. And Putin is constantly referring to that as an example, as he's following this example. But are these 3 points something that you, the speakers here, would also have felt and heard in your travelings and talking with Central Asians? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then we have a short question. Yeah.
Sorry. Actually, I have small comment.
But keep it really
very short. The revolution, so-called revolution, or someone is just may say that political change is happening in Kyrgyzstan not because of the democracy. They have democracy in that time. They have authoritarian, but soft authoritarian compared to the other Central Asian countries. This is explained by the Bremer's G curve. When the full authoritarian regime have kind of artificial stability. But when the authoritarian regime lose the power, then the chaos increasing. But the democratic regime have more stability because of the political changes will not affect the other sides. European Union is, yes, a different way to supporting Central Asian countries, or de-emphasizing European Union as an organization and the European countries as a countries, rule of law, civil society, but mainly they emphasize on security issues, threat to extremism and so on. That is giving the Central Asian leadership, political elite, ruling elite, a kind of opportunity to legitimize their authoritarian regime. So then in that case, the European Union rhetoric and the reality is clashing each other. The last.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, this is my question, which is this is not the contradict the representation of the European Union, and also to how the perceived by the Central Asian leadership. Okay, thank you.
Okay. In whichever order you want to answer these questions, but keep it short.
Yeah, just very shortly. When I was in Kazakhstan in 2012, I remember one of those notices from the officials of Ministry of Finance. It's like, now it's our chance to prove that we can manage finances. And right afterwards, there was quite massive advertisements on the international televisions, like invest in Kazakhstan. So, one of the reactions to the global economic crisis.
Okay. Olga?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Alain, that there were these three moments that contributed to the deterioration of the, let's say, of the image of the West. And I think it has accumulated somehow in the Ukraine crisis, 2014, well, last year, I would say, because the EU is considered to be less arrogant and so on than the US, but still under US leadership. And the perception in the Ukraine crisis was that while many Central Asians have also taken cautious stances against Russia's expansionism, the image of the Europe has also deteriorated actually in the context of the Ukraine crisis, because they perceive that the European Union, Brussels, have pushed Ukraine too much into the European bloc, thus belying somehow the bipolar nature of Ukraine. So also the image of the Europe has deteriorated, and especially what was strengthened the image that Europe is under the leadership of the US. And what you were saying about the neocons and the invasion in Iraq, indeed seeing pictures of Muslim population being mistreated by the US forces in Iraq has absolutely contributed to the decline of the image of the West. And what you have said also, the problem, of course, with somehow with this EU approach to Central Asia being prudent, but at the same time insisting somehow on human rights and democracy, is that some analysts or some observers say it's too accommodating with with the regimes, with the local regimes. And I recommend you an article of Luca Anceski, who has actually in one article explained how the human rights dialogue works with Kazakhstan, saying that Kazakhstan actually takes this human rights dialogue even as a justification to show that it's committed to these values, but not really implementing significant reforms. Mm-hmm. So sort of accommodation with these regimes.
Okay.
That's a danger.
Yeah, first of all, the comment about Kyrgyzstan, yes, revolutions that happen when a non-democratic regime opens up. I think in Kyrgyzstan we have different factors, primarily the disappointed expectations of the Aliyev period, requiring a lot of economic sacrifices, but without delivering the expected results of economic liberalization. And for the second revolution, the fact that Bakiyev was actually trying to create a repressive system way too fast that he could actually do. But we could discuss about this a lot more. I completely agree. Afghanistan, definitely, and Central Asians like to remind how the Soviet experiences still looked as a positive one in Afghanistan. Iraq, probably more than that. Criticism of the Iraq invasion is something that I've heard personally, not only from Central Asian Muslims, which you would expect to be more empathic towards the Iraqi situation, but even from Central Asian converts to evangelical Islam, to evangelical Christianity, which is incidentally one of the things that is closely correlated to neoconservatism. So even if even they criticize that, it means that we really made a big mistake in terms of image with the invasion of Iraq. Don't completely agree about the economic crisis in the sense that, yes, there is awareness of the fact that obviously we're not probably in the best situation ever, but still, it is pretty clear in the public perception, but of course we should do some statistic analysis on this, that even if we are in a situation of relative crisis, kind of welfare that you can get in Europe is definitely better than anywhere else. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So at this point, I will use my opportunities as a moderator. I have already overspent the time, but I hope the organizers won't punish me for this. So there will be opportunities to continue discussions that we started in this panel and also in previous panels, because if you look at your programs, as a last point, it states networking cocktail event hosted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Latvia. So as I've been informed that it takes place downstairs, so you can definitely take up your comments, your questions to these speakers also in a more, let's say, more unofficial manner. But before you go, please join me in a round of applause for our three speakers.